They called his camera a weapon. They had no idea the man holding it was armed with something far more powerful. His name was Marcus Cole, and on that Tuesday morning, he was not a threat. He was an artist. The air in Washington, D.C. was crisp, carrying the clean, sharp scent of ambition and stone that defined the city. He stood across from the monolithic facade of the Russell Senate Office Building, a place of rigid lines and cold marble, and saw only beauty. He saw the way the early sun softened its edges, turning the stone from intimidating gray to warm honey. He saw the story of power told not in laws but in light. His camera, a Leica M11, felt less like a machine and more like an extension of his own eye. It was heavy, solid, honest. He lifted it, the world shrinking to the small, perfect rectangle of his viewfinder. In that frame, the building wasn't just a structure, it was a character. He wasn't taking pictures, he was having a conversation. The quiet click of the shutter was his only reply. For an eye, he was lost in that silent dialogue, capturing the dance between shadow and light, the silent dignity of the columns, the weight of history that seemed to press down on the very air. He was working on a project commissioned by a patron who understood his vision, to capture the architectural soul of America, to find the humanity in its most imposing structures. He lowered the camera to change a lens, his fingers moving with the practiced grace of a surgeon. That's when the first shadow fell over him. It was sharp, sudden, cutting off the morning sun. Then another fell, boxing him in. He didn't have to look up to know what was happening. It was a feeling he knew in his bones, a change in atmospheric pressure that came when authority decided his presence was a problem. He slowly raised his head. Two uniformed Capitol Police officers stood in front of him, their expressions flat, their hands resting near their belts. A third man stood just behind them, wearing a perfectly tailored black suit that did nothing to hide the weapon holstered beneath his jacket. His eyes were different, colder. They weren't the eyes of a cop on a beat, they were the eyes of a man who saw threats everywhere. "That's far enough," the man in the suit said. His voice was calm, but it was the kind of calm that comes before a storm. "I need you to put the camera down, slowly." Marcus looked from the man's polished shoes to his unblinking stare. He didn't put the camera down. He held it at his side, his knuckles brushing against the cool metal. "Is there a problem, Agent?" he asked. His voice was even, betraying none of the adrenaline that had just begun to hum in his veins. The agent's lip curled into something that wasn't quite a smile. "You're taking detailed photographs of a federal building. That's the problem." He took a step forward. "This is a restricted area. Your activity is unauthorized." Marcus held his ground. "I'm standing on a public sidewalk, and photography is not a crime." The agent, whose name Tag Reed Thorne, let out a short, dismissive laugh. "That depends on what you're photographing and who you are. Right now, all I see is a potential threat." He gestured to the officers. "Secure his equipment." The word hit Marcus harder than a fist. Equipment. Thorne had called his camera, his voice, his art, equipment. One of the officers stepped forward, hand outstretched, his expression a mixture of duty and apology. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you for the camera." Marcus's grip tightened. For a black man in America, a camera wasn't just for taking pictures. It was a witness. It was evidence. It was a shield against the world's assumptions, and they were trying to take it from him. He looked at the officer, then at Agent Thorne, and in that moment he made a decision. He would not be loud. He would not be angry. He would be professional. He would be so professional it would become a weapon of its own. "Before you touch my camera," Marcus said, his voice dropping into a lower, more deliberate register, "I suggest you get your supervisor. Because the mistake you're all about to make is going to be a permanent one." Agent Thorne's arrogance hardened into something sharper. He saw Marcus's calm not as professionalism, but as defiance. He saw a man who didn't know his place, and he was going to enjoy teaching him. "You think you can intimidate me," Thorne said, stepping so close Marcus could smell the faint scent of coffee on his breath. "You have no idea the trouble you're in." He turned to the officers. "I am the supervisor. Now take the camera." The two officers moved in, their hands now firm, no longer apologetic. One reached for the Leica, his fingers fumbling with the strap. The other placed a hand on Marcus's arm. The touch was meant to be steadying, a procedural gesture, but it felt like an accusation. Marcus didn't resist. He let them take it. He watched as his camera, his lens, his connection to the world was passed into Agent Thorne's hands. Thorne held it like it was a confiscated weapon, turning it over in his gloved hands. He peered at the lens, then at the digital display on the back. "What are you really doing here?" he asked, his voice low and laced with suspicion. "Who are you working for?" "I'm a photographer," Marcus said, the words feeling hollow without the weight of the camera in his own hands. "A lot of spies call themselves photographers," Thorne countered. He began scrolling through the images Marcus had taken. He saw the beautiful, abstract shots of the building's facade, the play of light, the texture of the stone, but he didn't see art. He saw reconnaissance. These are detailed shots, close-ups of entry points, windows, security features. "They're shots of architecture," Marcus corrected him, his voice still impossibly calm. "I'm capturing the character of the building." Thorne looked up from the camera, his eyes narrowing into slits. "The character, don't play games with me. You're documenting this building for a reason. I want to know what it is." The officers stood on either side of Marcus now, a human cage. People walking by on the sidewalk started to notice. They slowed down, their faces a mixture of curiosity and concern. A man in a jogging suit pulled out his phone, not to call for help, but to record. Marcus saw it all from the corner of his eye. The public space had become a stage, and he was the unwilling star of a drama he didn't write. "I'm going to ask you again," Thorne said, his patience wearing thin. "Who do you work for?" Marcus met his gaze. He could have ended it right there. He could have reached into his pocket and produced the identification that would have turned Thorne's world upside down. But he didn't. Not yet. He wanted to see how far they would take it. He wanted the full, unvarnished truth of the moment to reveal itself. He wanted them to show him exactly who they were. "I'm a freelancer," Marcus answered, telling a partial truth. The word hung in the air, and Thorne seized it. A freelancer. No credentials, no press pass, no authorization. Just a man with a high-end camera taking sensitive photos of a government building a week before the international summit. He snapped the camera shut and handed it to one of the officers. "Hold this as evidence. We're taking him in." Taking him in. The words echoed in the open air. The officer beside Marcus reached for his wrist. The cold, metallic click of handcuffs being unsnapped was a sound that cut through the city's hum. This was the bottom. The public humiliation, the assumption of guilt so profound that his identity was erased, replaced by the caricature of a threat. He was no longer Marcus Cole, artist. He was a suspect. "You're making a serious mistake, Agent," Marcus said, his voice a low warning. "The only mistake here was yours," Thorne shot back. "You chose the wrong building on the wrong day, and you underestimated who you were dealing with." A faint, almost imperceptible smile touched Marcus's lips. It wasn't a smile of humor. It was a smile of profound, tragic irony. "No, Agent," he said softly. "You underestimated who you were dealing with." The officer's hand was on his wrist, the cold steel of the handcuff about to close. The crowd of onlookers had grown. The phone cameras were all pointed at him. The scene was set. The humiliation was complete. "Before you do that," Marcus said, his voice slicing through the tension, "there's something in my coat pocket, my right side. I suggest you look at it." Thorne hesitated. His instinct told him to ignore the request to proceed with the arrest, to maintain control. But Marcus's tone, the sheer, unshakable certainty in it, gave him pause. It was the tone of a man who knew something Thorne didn't. A man who was holding a winning hand and was just waiting for the right moment to play it. "What is it?" Thorne asked, his suspicion warring with a new, unwelcome flicker of doubt. "My identification," Marcus said simply. Thorne scoffed. "I have your driver's license. It's in your wallet, which we'll get to at the station." "That's not the ID I'm talking about," Marcus replied. He nodded toward his pocket. "Go ahead, Agent, check for yourself." For a long moment, nobody moved. The city seemed to hold its breath. The officer with the handcuffs stood frozen, his hand still on Marcus's wrist, waiting for the signal from Thorne. The crowd leaned in, sensing a turning point. Thorne's mind raced. Was this a bluff? A desperate attempt to stall? Or was there something more? His pride told him to ignore it, but his training, the small, cautious voice in the back of his head, told him to be sure. He couldn't afford to be wrong. With a sigh of frustration, Thorne gestured to the other officer. "Check his pocket, be careful." The officer approached Marcus cautiously, as if expecting a trap. He reached into the right pocket of Marcus's jacket. His fingers felt around, and then they stopped. His eyes widened slightly. He pulled his hand out, not with a wallet, but with a thin, silver chain. Dangling from the chain was a single, metallic dog tag. It wasn't a standard military issue. It was heavier, cleaner, engraved with a seal he didn't immediately recognize. He held it out for Thorne to see. Thorne took it, the metal cool against his skin. He flipped it over. The engraving was crisp, official, and utterly unbelievable. It read, "Marcus Cole, Official White House Photographer Project, Architectural Soul, All Access Federal Clearance, WH7 Silence." It was a profound, deafening silence that swallowed the noise of the city whole. The traffic, the distant sirens, the murmuring of the crowd, it all faded into nothing. The only thing that existed was the small, silver tag in Agent Thorne's hand and the calm, steady eyes of the man he was about to arrest. Thorne's gaze flicked from the tag to Marcus's face, then back to the tag. His mind, which had been so sure, so certain, was now a chaotic mess of denial and dawning horror. Official White House Photographer. The words didn't compute. They didn't fit the narrative he had constructed. The man he had labeled a spy, a threat, a freelancer with no credentials, worked at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. He didn't just have authorization. His authorization came from the highest office in the country. The officer holding the handcuffs slowly, almost reverently, released Marcus's wrist. He took a half step back, his face a mask of confusion and alarm. The other officer, the one holding the Leica, looked at the camera in his hands as if it had suddenly caught fire. Evidence had become property. Government property. Thorne felt a cold sweat prickle his brow. He had built a case in his mind based on a series of assumptions: a black man, an expensive camera, a sensitive location. Each assumption was a brick in a wall of prejudice, and that wall had just been demolished by a single 2-inch piece of metal. He had not just made a mistake, he had committed a catastrophic, career-ending blunder. He could feel the eyes of the crowd on him, the phone cameras still recording, but they were no longer capturing the arrest of a potential criminal. They were capturing the spectacular implosion of a federal agent's authority. This can't be right," Thorne stammered, the words catching in his throat. It was a weak protest, the last gasp of a man drowning in his own arrogance. Marcus didn't say a word. He just watched. He let the silence do the work. He let Thorne stand there, marinating in the consequences of his actions. He let him feel the full weight of his misjudgment. Finally, Thorne looked up, his face pale, his professional mask shattered. The smugness was gone, replaced by a raw, desperate panic. I need to verify this," he said, pulling out his phone with trembling hands. "By all means," Marcus said, his voice still even. "Call your office. Ask for Director Stevens. Tell him Agent Thorne has detained Marcus Cole on the corner of Constitution and First. Then wait for his instructions." The name dropped into the silence like a stone in a still pond. Director Stevens, the head of his entire division. Mentioning him by name was not a guess. It was a statement. A statement that said, "I know who you are, I know who your boss is, and you are in a world of trouble you cannot begin to comprehend." Thorne's fingers fumbled on the screen of his phone. He didn't make the call. He didn't need to. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that the dog tag was real. The man he had treated with such contempt, the man he had been seconds away from putting in handcuffs, had a clearance level that likely surpassed his own. He slowly, carefully, handed the dog tag back to Marcus. His hand was shaking. "My apologies, Mr. Cole," he said, the words sounding foreign and brittle. "There's been a misunderstanding." Marcus took the chain and slipped it back into his pocket. He looked at Thorne, his expression unreadable. "No, Agent Thorne," he said, his voice quiet but carrying the force of a final judgment. "There was no misunderstanding. You understood perfectly. You just had the wrong information." The power dynamic hadn't just shifted, it had inverted with the force of a seismic event. Agent Thorne, who moments ago had been the embodiment of federal authority, now looked small, stripped bare in the harsh morning light. His suit seemed to hang off him, his posture defeated. The two police officers stood awkwardly, avoiding eye contact, wishing they could disappear into the pavement. Thorne cleared his throat, a desperate attempt to regain some semblance of control. "Return his camera," he ordered the officer beside him, his voice tight. The officer practically shoved the Leica back into Marcus's hands, muttering a barely audible, "Sorry, sir." Marcus took his camera, his fingers wrapping around the familiar grip. He checked the lens, his movements deliberate and unhurried. He was not going to let them off the hook with a rushed apology and a hasty retreat. He was going to make them witness the full extent of their error. He turned the camera on, checked the settings, and then, without so much as a glance at the three men watching him, he lifted the viewfinder to his eye, and he went back to work. He framed a shot of the building's grand archway, the very picture of institutional power. The click of the shutter was loud in the stunned silence. It was an act of defiance more profound than any angry words could ever be. He was reclaiming his space, his art, his dignity, right in front of the men who had tried to strip him of all three. Thorne stood frozen, a statue of humiliation. He couldn't leave. To walk away now would be an admission of guilt broadcast to the dozens of phones still pointed in his direction. He and the officers were now unwilling participants in Marcus's photo shoot, their presence a silent testament to their colossal failure. They had become the background characters in the story of their own undoing. Marcus moved with a fluid, confident grace, his focus entirely on his craft. He walked a few paces down the sidewalk, composing another shot. He knelt to capture a low angle of the steps, the light catching the worn edges of the granite. Each click of the shutter was a punctuation mark in the silent lesson he was teaching them. It said, "This is who I am. This is what I do. You did not stop me. You only stopped yourselves." After several long, excruciating minutes, Marcus lowered the camera for the last time. He carefully placed the lens cap back on and slid the camera into its bag, the soft zip of the closure sounding like a final verdict. He slung the bag over his shoulder and finally turned to face Agent Thorne. Thorne looked like a man waiting for a sentence to be passed. "Mr. Cole," he began, his voice strained. "On behalf of my team, I want to offer my sincerest—" Marcus held up a hand, cutting him off. He didn't want the apology. An apology was an easy way out. It was a way for Thorne to feel better, to believe the incident was closed. But for Marcus, it wasn't closed. It was a scar, another in a long line of them. "Agent Thorne," Marcus said, his voice devoid of heat but heavy with consequence. "An apology is for a mistake. What you did was not a mistake. It was a choice. You made a choice based on what you saw, and you chose to see a threat instead of a person." He paused, letting the words sink in. "My camera sees everything. It doesn't judge. It just captures what is there: light, shadow, truth." He looked Thorne directly in the eye. "You should try it sometime." He didn't wait for a response. He turned and began to walk away, his steps even and measured. He walked past the crowd, past the people who were now looking at him with a mixture of awe and respect. He didn't look back. He didn't need to. He could feel the weight of Thorne's stare on his back, the burning shame of a man who had been so certain of his power, only to have it dismantled by the quiet truth. As he reached the corner, the hum of the city returned, but it sounded different to Marcus now. It was the sound of a world that was still flawed, still full of prejudice and assumption. But it was also the sound of a world where, sometimes for a brief, glorious moment, dignity gets the final word. He thought of the photos he had taken, the story of light and stone. But he knew the most important picture he had captured that day wasn't on his memory card. It was etched forever in the memory of Agent Thorne. Some pictures tell a story. This one had just rewritten it.